Luis Martinez Pedro and Sandu Darye inaugurated a two-man exhibition at the University of Havana on April 25, 1955. Promoted as Cuba's first concrete exhibition, the show included a number of Darye's transformable structures and examples of what he called optical poetry. Martinez Pedro showed a new series of geometric paintings and collages. In retrospect, the exhibition laid the groundwork for the rise of Cuban concretism over the latter half of the decade, directing local conversations around abstract art in purposefully international and conceptual directions. The momentum of the concretos, led by Darye and Martinez Pedro, supplanted the earlier focus around the group Los Once, whose practice and polemics of gestural abstraction had dominated the dialogue around Cuba's vanguardia since 1952. As Los Once faltered, officially disbanding in June 1955, the concretos built momentum from Darye and Martinez Pedro's exhibition, eventually forming the group Los Diez, the 10, at the end of the decade. At a moment when the city of Havana came itself to be visualized by many as an abstraction, under the urbanizing and Corbusian rubric of a new pilot plan, the aesthetics of concretism appeared well adapted to a metropolis built for the future, a beautiful and functional city as advertised here at the leading edge of urban design and post-war utopian projection. Amid this conceptual patterning of the city, the first concrete exhibition marked a clear point of origin for Havana's concrete phenomenon and defined it from the beginning in progressively national and transnational terms, as I'll suggest this morning. In many ways, two sides of the same coin, Darye and Martinez Pedro represented reciprocal tendencies within concretism over the decades spanning the mid-1950s through the mid-1960s. Their complementarity appeared already by the time of the 1955 exhibition. In short, a reviewer noted, quote, Luis Martinez Pedro immerses himself in painting. Sandu Darye breaks away from it. The fourth dimension preoccupies them both. For the former, in the fixity of stillness, and for the latter, in an obsession with movement. Perceptual questions predominated at mid-decade as each artist probed the space and time of his medium, painting, collage, sculpture, through different incursions within geometry. Cuban concretism was more than a purely visual paradigm, and it projected a multisensory and even affective aesthetic that reached its utopian apex in the early 1960s. From Darye's optical poetics to Martinez Pedro's now iconic series, Territorial Waters, below on the right, Cuba's concrete movement visualized and, in an almost premonitory way, even anticipated the conceptual and geographical complexities of Cuban art in the early post-revolutionary going. Darye and Martinez Pedro took different routes to concretism, but their paths first converged at the beginning of the 1950s when they co-edited, with Mario Carreño, the groundbreaking arts magazine Noticias de Arte, or Art News. Across 11 issues, published between 1952 and 1953, the magazine sought to raise the profile of Havana as an avant-garde center within the Americas, integrating local and international arts news and championing the cause of modern Cuban art. Their network of collaborators stretched from Jose Gomez Sicre, newly appointed chief of the Visual Arts Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., to Giulia Kosice, the co-founder of the Madi movement in Argentina. The magazine's inter-American purview privileged contemporary currents within abstraction, seen both in its promotion of Cuban artists working in that direction and in the editorial emphasis on related modernist topics, for instance, Alfred Barr and the Museum of Modern Art, Apollinaire and the Ballet Russe, Arnold Schoenberg, Bela Bartok. Geometric works by Darie and Martinez Pedro, among others, illustrated the magazine's coverage of the 26th Venice Biennale and also the second Sao Paulo Biennale. Although Noticias de Arte ceased publication with this final issue, it had provided a critical early endorsement of modernism and its incipient turn toward abstraction. For both of these artists, the magazine's pages not only amplified the transnational dimensions of their work, but also served as a stimulus for their explorations within concretism. In May and June of 1953, Martinez Pedro showed a series of concrete paintings in Havana at the home of the architect Miguel Gaston and at the Gallery La Rampa, respectively. The first concrete exhibition of 1955 was in fact a misnomer, as it overlooked these two earlier exhibitions, which also carried the concrete appellation. The catalog for the May 1953 show included an instructive text by Walter Gropius, in which he underlined correspondences between the structures of music and abstract art. As in painting, the cited text began, quote, "Musical compositions consist of form and content. Their form is solely the work of the composer, who makes his musical ideas comprehensible through the use of counterpoint, a universally accepted system that divides the world of sound into intervals governed by fixed laws. Laws of counterpoint, harmony, and scale had historically informed the visual arts as well," Gropius explained, but recent lapses underscored the need for the abstract painter of our time, he intoned, to, quote, "use his creative powers to establish a new counterpoint of vision, a new vision." The contrapuntal metaphor provided an insightful interpretive gloss to the 17 paintings that Martinez Pedro exhibited, aided in some cases by suggestive titles, Andante, Crescendo, Allegro, Opus. In Crescendo and Opus 1, here, for example, compositional rhythm is built through the dialogue of colors across a central vertical plane, the visual intervals paced by offsetting bars of color. Music, as a measure of time and space, would become a salient and recurring point of reference for Martinez Pedro over the next 10 years, eventually marking the allegorical time of displacement and diaspora. Yet even in the purely visual terms set out by these early concrete compositions, the import of musical structure is already clear. In their polyrhythmic spacing and tonal balance, the paintings innovate within and against traditional harmonies of color and form. In a similar way, Darier's so-called optical poetry from mid-decade anticipates the more explicit overtures to music that characterize his later work. Born in Romania and cognizant of the European avant-garde through the 1930s, Darier turned to concretism with the advantage of a more expansive historical and transatlantic perspective. By the early 1950s, his practice was evolving rapidly within the constructivist mode, aided by frequent correspondence with Kosuche and the Mahdi Group and also through encounters with neoplasticism in New York, where he exhibited in 1951 with artists including Piet Mondrian, Georges Bentancurlu, and Joseph Albers at Rose Fried Gallery. His paintings and work on paper from this period betray his early neoplastic orientation. The use of primary colors and non-colors, black and white, blocked within geometric patterns, establish clear affinities with Mondrian's vision of pure painting, its elements held in dynamic and irreducible equilibrium. As early as 1922, in an essay on the feasibility of neoplastic music, Mondrian had articulated the temporal structure of his painting, writing, quote, "We look at a neoplastic work and perceive successive relationships. After the first general impression, our glances go from one plane to its oppositions, and from these back to the plane. In this way, avoiding traditional representation, we continually perceive new relationships, which produce the total impression." This dialectic of vision, in which the optical vibrations serve not only a pictorial purpose, but also a fundamentally productive one, the total impression, has both a musical derivation and a deeply historicizing function. The musicality of this cumulative active viewing accords with the kind of compositional or contrapuntal dynamics already seen in Martínez Pedro's paintings from this period. But to an even greater degree by this time, Darier's paintings extended these internal dialectics outward, mediating as well the historical conditions of the artist's own position in Cuba into the 1950s. Darier had fled Europe for Havana in 1941, incidentally just 1 year after Mondrian arrived in New York, and he became a Cuban citizen in 1945. The experience of exile and displacement undoubtedly presented new challenges, artistic and otherwise. By the time of his first exhibition at Havana's Lyceum in 1949, Darier had reinvented himself as an abstract artist, departing from the humoristic mood that had characterized his earlier work in France. The source of this change was almost certainly internal. The precepts of neoplasticism and of abstraction generally were long familiar to him, gleaned from the 15 years he spent in Paris. The visual culture of 1940s Cuba, characterized by the lush tropicalism of the Havana School, would not have obviously precipitated his turn toward concretism. Darier's compass points at the beginning of the 1950s rather stretched from Europe to New York and South America, and his early concrete practice, in particular, I think the collages and mixed media works, rendered the spatial and temporal ruptures of these transnational coordinates in neoplastic or plastic terms. Harry Cooper has suggested that Mondrian's transatlantic paintings, so-called, repeatedly revised in New York and inscribed often with double dates, quote, meditate on exile, offering an abstract iconography of its dialectics of rift and continuity. Cooper considers the dialectics in Hegelian terms, explaining Mondrian's famous enthusiasm for piano boogie-woogie as an ultimate, that is teleological means, of giving shape to his experience of dislocation. The sonic boom, as it were, of jazz music provided the final strike to neoplastic duality and opposition, allowing him to find his return to an original unity. In other words, the sublation of duality. Darier's work of the 1950s has not yet resolved or sublated the problems of repetition and rhythm, but it worked through a similar dialectics of viewing in time and disjunction as a measure of distance, in a more subtle way than the articulated sculptures, which the viewer can physically manipulate. The different layers and textures of the collaged picture surfaces superimpose the temporality of viewing and the tactile conjunctions of space in very shallow relief. This dynamic balance between internal and external pressures is occasionally hypostasized in the painted frames attached to a number of Darier's paintings from the 1950s, which further destabilize the boundaries between art and life. Indeed, the utopian impulse behind the original neoplastic vision, that is, visual harmony and unity as a cognate for an ideal society, invested Cuba's concrete movement with keen contemporary resonance by the end of the decade. The momentum from Darier and Martínez Pedro's 1955 exhibition was amplified by the return of Lolo Soldevilla from Paris in 1956. I've omitted Soldevilla from my talk this morning just for reasons of time, but she was also a significant figure of this movement, and lately something of a market phenom herself. Working together, Soldevilla, Darier, and Martínez Pedro initiated a didactic program of public lectures and exhibitions, beginning with a survey of leading-edge abstract art from the School of Paris that included works by Serge Poliakoff, Jesus Soto, Hans Arp, and Sonia Delaunay, among many others. The opening of their Galeria Couleur Russe in October 1957 marked a milestone for Cuba's concrete movement, providing a dedicated exhibition space and incubating the cohort of artists that later formed the group Los Diez. Founded by Soldevilla and Pedro de Urrea, the gallery built an exhibition program focused heavily around abstraction, showing Cuban and international artists alongside each other. By late 1958, it also functioned as a bastion of resistance, de Urrea later remarked, preserving a space of artistic freedom and creation amid an increasingly asphyxiated political climate. Darie and Martinez Pedro were founding members of Los Diez and exhibited in the group's inaugural exhibition held at the Galeria Couleur Russe at the end of 1959. The exhibition, the first of only 3 that the group organized before its dissolution in 1961, fell largely under the radar, but the group's collectivist social manifesto was not inimical to the early revolutionary mandate of the time. Quote, "This is concrete painting because each painting is a new reality," Darie explained, positing his artwork's direct relationship with the world and suggesting its integration into the social landscape. Among the first concrete responses to the post-1959 cultural climate were Martinez Pedro's Territorial Waters, a magisterial series of paintings first exhibited in Havana in 1963. Tonal monochromes, the paintings riff on the structures of neoplasticism. Primary colors soften into gradations of blue, and in a few instances of deep mauve. Right angles become elliptical curves. The vaunted universalism of concrete art is here localized within the specific reality of 1960s Cuba, the revolutionary maelstrom distilled into circles and semicircles, whose shapes echo sonorously and chromatically beyond the edges of the frame. As allegorical images, the series offers a pensive referendum on the political conditions of the island itself, imaging Cuba's simultaneous isolation and independence through the flux of its surrounding waters. In this sense, the paintings both demarcate Cuba's territorial space and point out its permeability, perhaps envisioning the diasporic future. Martinez Pedro's poetics are here both more literal and more Catholic than Darier's. The ruptures of the territorial waters resonate as fissures within a national body, whereas the dislocations of Darier's optical poetry disclose a more personal, transnational past. And yet the 2 series of work speak to the same existential desire to inscribe a position within the world. In both cases, the concrete fields image what Darie described as a new reality, one grounded in the dialectics of history and of vision. The reality effect of these works transpires in the fullness of time over the progressive act of viewing, contrapuntally as before or centrifugally in the territorial waters, and also through the lens of contemporary history. The momentum of the concrete movement largely subsided over the 1960s as the Galeria Couleur Russe closed, the members of Los Diez dispersed, and the cultural field turned in different directions. Yet the afterlife of concretism was arguably already written into its beginning, vis-a-vis the heuristic role of music in the movement's exploration of space and time. For Darie and Martinez Pedro both, the textures and intervals of music had facilitated the structural rhythm of their work from the start of the 1950s, serving as a persistent and resourceful medium of engagement. The introduction of concrete or electroacoustic, as they say, music to Cuba in 1959, following the return of the writer and musicologist Alejo Carpentier from Paris, considerably deepened these connections between art and music. Led by the composers Juan Blanco, Leo Bruver, and Carlos Fariñas, La Música Nueva, as it became known, explored open forms of composition, experimenting with graphic scores, aleatoric composition, and electronic sound. Although the symbiosis between concrete art and music in Cuba deserves much greater attention, two collaborations stand out here in conclusion with respect to Darie and Martinez Pedro. Darie experimented with a range of art forms in the 1960s, drawing out the plasticity of time and movement in sculpture, ballet, and film. Cosmorama, Spatial Poem No. 1, directed by Enrique Pineda Barnett, with music by Bela Bartok, Pierre Schaeffer, and Fariñas, is Darie's most advanced cinematic work. The short film filters light and shadow through a series of geometric objects set in mechanical motion, the colors changing synesthetically from shifting perspectives. The cinematic conflation of art and music, music made plastic, art rendered as sound, marks the apotheosis of Darie's concrete vision. The disjunctive, at times jarring, textures of the film suggests a new iconography for a revolutionary society still in the process of formation, distilling its utopian promise into an ultimate poetics of space and time. If the musicality of Martinez Pedro's Territorial Waters has been widely recognized, the series also served, in a telling reversal, as a point of origin for a musical composition of the same name. Fariñas dedicated his Aguas Territoriales to Martinez Pedro, acknowledging their creative synergies and again the richness of the maritime metaphor. Among the first Cuban composers to incorporate serialism, electroacoustic techniques, and the dodecaphonic scale into his practice, Fariñas based his Territorial Waters on the sound of water itself, which he recorded and then processed, altering variables such as speed and frequency into a final mixture of 16 tracks. Fariñas' composition effectively renewed the historical consciousness embedded within Martinez Pedro's original series, providing the connective tissue between concrete art, almost forgotten by the mid-1980s, and Cuba's contemporary reality. Quote, "The works of Luis Martinez Pedro are Cuban," Darie wrote in the year of the Revolution, 1959, "but of universal vision." Darie's words apply equally to his own work, which became fully Cuban, as it were, over the course of his engagement with concrete art through the 1950s. From the early lessons of his optical poetry to the culminating force of Martinez Pedro's Territorial Waters, the two artists traveled along similar and often parallel wavelengths. Cuban concretism was a short-lived phenomenon, petering out by the mid-1960s for many reasons, and not all political. But over its course, concrete art functioned as a medium of historical experience, distilling the tensions of the period, exile, internationalism, revolution, diaspora, through the abstractions of geometry and ultimately of sound. Thank you.
Even if many remarkable works and artists of the 40s and the 50s are usually labeled as concrete, concrete art is not a completely orthodox feature of the post-war period. This is not just due to those artistic experiences of the 20s and the 30s that could or perhaps should be included in such a movement, but also because concrete artists who began to operate in the 40s distinguished themselves from their colleagues for their objective and functional approach, a feature clearly inspired by 20s cyclicite. Possibly due to this, concrete art is not always included in post-war art reviews. In the region of the Rio de la Plata, however, the unique issue of the journal Arturo, published in Buenos Aires in 1944, marks a sort of starting point for local concretism. Such interpretation offers and offered some advantages. Arturo is one of the main collective products of the short period in which concrete artists were united and collaborated, before dividing themselves in various groups, often quarreling with one another. So it represents an ecumenical beginning. Furthermore, even if the journal contents are contradictory from many points of view, they constitute on the whole a sort of manifesto, an almost necessary feature for a movement mainly interpreted as an avant-garde. Finally, choosing Arturo as a beginning allows synchronizing post-war and concretism. Probably because it was perceived as the most advanced front line of national abstract art, concretism began to be observed by Argentine historians during its development. The most exhaustive examples of such an attention are the works of Blanca Stabile published in Ver y Estimar, a journal on the barricades for modern art. But the systematization process of concrete arts history began in the 80s. Also in this case, the main reason for the interest in concretism lied in its pioneering role in artistic modernity. More recent studies and exhibitions have pushed behind the temporary frontier of such modernity, including the experiences of some abstract artists of the 30s or even back to the 10th of Emilio Pettoruti or Jules Solar. Having been trained as an architect and being Italian, my perspective on Argentine concretism is doubly external. In the present talk, I try to trace a map situating Argentine concretism in the post-war context. Among the various groups and tendencies, I mainly concentrate on the Association Arte Concreto Invención, AACI. This is not due to any aesthetic or artistic preference, but because I found that the activities of artists as Tomás Maldonado and Alfredo Lito are particularly significant if observed by the perspective I chose. Time. As it has been mentioned, concrete art hardly matches with the chronology considering the post-war years as a total independent period from the 30s. But concretism deals with time also because of the evolution and the changes that can be observed in its development. Retrospectively seen, 1944 appears as a key moment for concrete art and for the general artistic outlook as well. For instance, in Basel Kunsthalle, the exhibition Konkrete Kunst was held, and in Zurich, Max Bill founded the journal Abstract Concrete. On the Rio de la Plata's banks, in a famous writing, Jorge Luis Borges reflected on the odd position Argentina was occupying in the map of the world, governed by a political system that seemed overtaken by history. The end of the war encouraged a civil protest against the filo-fascist colonel's government that involved also the artist. The most significant action was probably the organization of the Salón Independiente, where renowned artists as Raquel Forner exposed works openly inspired by the end of the war. Concrete artists didn't join that exhibition. Their political opposition to the government and later to Peronism was not questionable, as many of them were members of the Argentine Communist Party. But their aesthetic radicalism prevented them from taking part in any political concurrence, and finally excluded them also from the party. Or perhaps it would be better to say that for them, politics couldn't be separated from poetics, and as it is easy to recognize from their writing, art was a total activity comprising the whole life. In a politically and culturally hostile climate, where the triumph of realist art was marked by majestic works as the decoration of the ceilings of the Gallerias Pacifico, concrete artists claimed their art as the only true expression of realism, an art made of real objects actively related with the context. As Maldonado wrote, a work of art is not to contain, but to be, to exist. Such strategies and poetics led concrete artists in a sort of isolation. In this condition, they looked mostly towards foreign countries, searching for affinities, models, and alliances. So, by the end of the 40s, the European travel appeared to many members of the AACI as a sort of necessity, if not an unavoidable step for their artistic evolution. In some cases, as the travel Tomás Maldonado did in 1948, such experiences have become legendary issues in Argentine history of art. These travels could be seen as a breaking point in Argentine concretism history. They marked the end of a season and the beginning of a new one. This can be observed not just in the personal and collective artistic trajectories, noticing, for instance, how quite diffuse practices as the marco recortado cutout frame were generally abandoned, but also in the attitude group as the ACI had towards the artistic, social, and political context. In the case of Maldonado, what probably helped him most in establishing new contacts and relationships inside Argentine elites, in addition to the appeal that every intellectual recently returned from Europe had, were the plomos, the body ties he bought, as the story goes, in Italy, spending almost all his money and having to return to Argentina as a third-class passenger. These instruments made it possible for Maldonado to be involved in many editorial activities as a graphic designer. This new qualification drastically changed the concrete artist relation system. They left the self-produced and highly polemical publication of the mid-40s to enter a new editorial world, more heterogeneous and dialectic. The most significant example of this new phase is probably the journal Ciclo, founded in 1948. On the one hand, the journal has been pointed out as a crucial step in the development of Argentinian graphic design as a discipline. On the other hand, it is not less noticeable that a journal which wasn't a direct expression of the concrete milieu published texts by Piet Mondrian, Laszlo Molinocchi, and Max Biel that had not been previously published in Spanish. Most likely, Maldonado wasn't involved just as a graphic designer, but also as a contents proposer. Few years later, the concretists inaugurated this culturally open attitude. The relationship between concretism and the political power showed equally evident changes if compared with the mid-40s. The most relevant issue in this regard was probably the great exhibition La Pintura e la Scultura Argentina de este siglo, held in the National Museum of Fine Art between October 52 and March 53. The presence of abstract art was significant, including many works by concrete artists. Meanwhile, artists like Maldonado, Lito, Girola, Iommi, and Prati passed from a radical, one could say avant-gardist group, to a new collective entity, artistically and politically less defined. Such mutation was reflected by the new denomination, where the words concrete and invention disappeared to be replaced by a more neutral adjective, modern. The Grupo de Artistas Modernos de la Argentina did not last long, but reached one of the main purposes, asserting itself on the international scene. In fact, in 1953, work by its members were firstly exposed in the Museum of Modern Art of Rio de Janeiro, and then moved to the Stedelijk Museum of Amsterdam. And they were also included in the Argentine selection sent to the second edition of Sao Paulo Biennale. The peak of international success approximately coincided with the end of concretism. Most Argentine art historians assumed 1955 as the end point of its trajectory. Such a choice is probably linked with the end of Peronist government, which occurred that same year. Nevertheless, there are no doubts that artists like Alfredo Lito, starting from the mid-50s, began to experiment in new techniques that gradually led them out of the concrete field. Besides, in May of 1954, Tomás Maldonado left the country to join the teaching staff of the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Ulm and stopped painting until recent years. Space. If 1955 could be therefore considered as a turning point for the Argentine artistic scene, moving from a country to another, such a choice became more controversial. Among the many possible case studies, I'll briefly reflect on the relationship between Max Biel and Tomás Maldonado that began in 1948 during the legendary European travel of the latter. In 1955, the publisher Nueva Visión started its activity launching the book Max Biel by Maldonado. It is composed by an anthology of Biel's writing and a selection or reproduction of his work introduced by a text by Maldonado. The latter is a celebration of Biel as artist and as a modern man, and as one of the few creators who managed to produce works not definable by a style but by a method, and was translated, like Biel's writing, in Spanish, English, German, and French, disclosing the popularizing scope of the book. Almost simultaneously, the journal NV, from the initials of Nueva Visión, founded by Maldonado in 1951, dedicated a long article to the HFG. In that moment, Maldonado was in Ulm. That year, he took on basic course instruction, having assisted Biel's basic course dutifully during the preceding year. As is well known, the idyll between Maldonado and Bill didn't last long, and in a few months, the HFG became a battleground for them. But it is probably more interesting to focus on the role Maldonado and other Argentinian and Brazilian artists, critics, and institutions played in the post-war consecration of Bill as the main exponent of concretism. The first months after Maldonado returned to Argentina were decisive for the extraordinary reception of Bill's writing and works in Argentina and in Brazil. In September 1948, the Salón de Nuevas Realidades, held in Buenos Aires at Van Riel Gallery, showed works by concrete artists together with works of industrial design and architecture, including the Argentine architect Cesar Gianello and the Italian architectural firm BBPR. Ernesto Rogers, the most representative member of BBPR, who in those months was living in Argentina, concluded the exhibition giving a speech and declaring three artists the most significant: Hans Arp, George van Tongerlo, and particularly Max Bill. The following year, Maldonado was involved in a new publishing experience, being asked by some students of architecture to take charge of the graphic design of their bulletin. As it had been for Ciclo, the role of Maldonado dealt also with contents. In this case, they consisted of a short biography of Max Bill and of an essay titled Design and Social Life. There, he considered industrial design as the main task to solve the divorce between art and life, adopting thus a very similar perspective to the one used by Bill in many writings of that time. 1951 was the very crucial year for Bill's consecration in South America, and probably for his affirmation outside Switzerland. An exhibition dedicated to his work in preparation since 1949 finally opened at the Institute of Art in Sao Paulo. And that same year, Bill's metal sculpture, Tripartite Unity, won the first prize of the first edition of Sao Paulo Biennales, and these photographs invaded South American journals. In the meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, Maldonado was preparing an exhibition titled The Good Form, Function, Technique, and Form, Exhibition of Visual Culture, that never took place, but that, since the title, reflected its inspirations in Bill's work. In December, the first issue of the journal NV appeared. Bill was portrayed on the cover and mentioned as a pioneer in the synthesis of arts, and in addition was celebrated by a writing of Ernesto Rogers. Borders. To a certain extent, the journal kept on the tradition of Ciclo, and probably it was not a casualty if its foundation came closely after the end of the latter. As long as it would remain in Buenos Aires, a journal was for Maldonado an undeniable tool. From the one hand, it represented an autonomous cultural space free from possible governmental interferences. On the other hand, it offered an efficient diplomatic channel to cultivate its relationship inside the Buenos Aires elite and with foreign personalities, a table to make alliances. But the journal was also and mostly innovative. If Ciclo's subtitle recited rather conventionally modern art, literature, and thinking, NV forged an unprecedented and synthetic expression to define a cultural territory still largely to be explored. Journal of Visual Culture. In the editorial staff open view, such culture stretched from dodecaphonic music to poetry to structural engineering. Maldonado played once more a key role. His heterogeneous acquaintances and this wide library facilitated him to hybridize numerous perspectives, keeping them together by a methodological rigor inspired by the Sachlichkeit of the heroic period. On the second page of the first issue, a short anonymous note traced like a manifesto the journal's cultural program. I quote, NV has a challenging purpose in a limited domain, attempts to foster the synthesis of all visual arts in an objective and functional direction. NV is therefore the journals of the architects, city planners, painters, and sculptors fighting against the falsification of their respective expressive elements and for the invention of visual forms released from every illusory aesthetic. NV spread the theoretical and practical efforts to provide everyday life with good and efficient forms, to go beyond the conventional distinction between fine arts and applied arts, to bind artists with serial production. End of quote. Some concepts directly originated, also terminologically, from the years of the militancy in the AACI. Other ones were carrying on the considerations developed by Maldonado a few years before and reflected the great attention paid to Max Bill's works and thinking. But architecture and industrial design were not, as before, observed just as a solution for the divorce between art and life. They were the object of specific observations, focusing, even if without the coherence that distinguished the discourse on visual arts, on specific authors and works. This new perspective can be explained if one observes the editorial staff composition. Although it changed a lot during the years, one could say that most of its members came partly from the AACI and partly from OM, Organization of Modern Architecture, a group of students of architecture that met Maldonado on the occasion of the publishing of the Bulletin, or through common acquaintances, as was the case of the architect Amancio Williams. So, if NV on the one hand had never completely stopped to be a journal linked to concretism, from the other hand it was a journal of architecture and something else as well, a studio to look assiduously for the synthesis of the visual culture elements. This lasted until the political and social condition of the country caused in the editorial staff members and in the authors a sort of cultural resistance that made them, one could say, devoted to their objective and functional direction that constituted from the beginning one of the main coordinates of the journal. But after Perón's fall, this implied a series of limitations and restrictions that perhaps to some of them seemed to be excessive. On the other hand, the formative season of the academic studies was over, and the new political course seemed to encourage the beginning of a new operating phase, from professional practice to academic teaching. Last but not least, financial straits characterizing from the beginning the activity of the journal inexorably sanctioned its end after the last troubled issue published in 1957. Thank you.
So, good morning. Thank you for the invitation and your presence. My paper is a first exemplary study of a larger research project, which I will undertake in the next 2 to 3 years. It is mainly based on the archival material of the Haus der Kunst. Consequently, there should be another second paper on the same exhibition based on the material of the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro. So this is just a little pre-commentary. Today I would like to show in a detailed analysis of one particular example how differentiated cultural relations between Brazil and Germany were in the 1950s, and explain who took the initiative and thus the lead in a dialogue that can be described within a West and the Rest context, as Stuart Hall suggested. To achieve this, 2 different entanglements need to be kept in mind, namely the one between artists and theorists who all gathered their individual experiences on their trips, during their studies and through personal exchange, and, which is my focus today, those entanglements that can be traced back to political motives and were also ingrained in cultural institutions. Especially the post-war era was dominated by the emergence of cultural policies that suddenly took on global dimensions through bilateral cultural agreements and the gradual appearance of exhibitions with increasingly non-Western art in European museums. My lecture hopes to contribute to the political project Europe, which is often the object of post-colonial analysis today. The focus of my presentation is the German reaction to the exhibition of Brazilian artists shown at Haus der Kunst in summer 1959, which was passed on by its organizers in Munich to other places in Europe. It was first designed as an exhibition exchange of German and Brazilian art between Brazil and the young Federal Republic of Germany, even though in the end it was not realized in this manner. The Brazilian exhibition was to be put together by the Museu the Arte Moderne in Rio de Janeiro, and the German exhibition by the Haus Kunst. Due to financial reasons, however, the German project was cancelled in October 1958 during the preparations. Although the agreement had been that the Brazilian exhibition was to be financed by Brazil and the German exhibition by Germany, the Brazil exhibition was never questioned by the Brazilian side. It was put together with great enthusiasm by Niomar Muniz Bittencourt, director of the Brazilian Museum at that time. The imbalance between the two parties' financial involvement was only partly rectified by Munich's director Peter R. Ardes's contribution, who managed to take the exhibition to other places in Europe later. This detail is significant because it may already show the two countries' different depths of interest toward the project. To comprehend the significance of this exhibition tour in a larger context, we need to take a look at the time immediately after the war, which in Germany was marked by the physical rebuilding of the country and the return to exhibitions, especially those showing the degenerate art that had been frowned upon by the National Socialists. In this context, a Documenta 1 in 1955, curated by Arnold Bode and Werner Haftmann, and whose main focus was on abstract painting of the 1920s and 30s, plays an essential role. Ludwig Grote, who became the first director of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg in 1951, chose the same artists for the first German contribution to the Biennial in Sao Paulo in 1951. Although in Brazil he selected works completed after 1945. In the concept of Documenta 2, 1959, the same year as the exhibition of Brazilian artists took place, the officially promoted art of the time would culminate in informal antacisme. As press reviews show, its aesthetic value remained controversial among the public as well as the critics. The reception of Documenta 2 and of the exhibition of Brazilian artists is strikingly similar, as we will later see. On the other side of the Atlantic, the new capital of Brasilia was about to be opened, and the neo-concrete movement began to crystallize after several exhibitions showing abstract and concrete art. This is significant because the second wave of Brazilian modernism in the 50s and 60s that would develop into participatory, three-dimensional, and installation-based work already set strong signs of significance. The acceptance of a concrete art closely connected with Oscar Niemeyer's architecture and Roberto Burle-Marx's landscaping, as well as the promotion of programs educating students in industrial design, goes hand in hand with Brazil's major re-evaluation and modernization of artistic and social issues. In the late 1940s, Italian-Brazilian architect Lina Bobardi developed impressive modern museum plans for the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, MASP, founded in 1947, aimed at systematically educating all layers of society. Ideas like a mobile exhibition display of the collection and glass fronts opening to the outside were comparably realized in the new construction of the MASP built from 1957. Between 1951 and 1954, Oscar Niemeyer realized an entire building park inside the Parque do Ibirapuera for the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1951, whose most conspicuous buildings became the Pavilhão Chinchillo Matarazzo, also called the Pavilhão do Bienal, spanning 30,000 square meters. The MASP, as well as the Museu de Arte Moderna de Rio de Janeiro, a multi-purpose building containing a school, exhibition rooms, and concert halls, designed in the brutalist style by Afonso Reidi in 1953, and still under construction in 1959, were not only extremely modern architecturally speaking, but as educational institutions, they also included highly progressive facilities from the very beginning. In retrospect, we can identify several factors that explain why the two countries developed an interest in each other. From the Brazilian side, the German art of classic modernism and Bauhaus kept rousing people's interest. But artists and exhibition organizers alike were also keen to show their work in Germany and earn a place internationally, as the Brazilian exchange project with Munich shows very clearly. The museum in Rio had a large selection of works by top German artists on its wish list for the exhibition. I quote a letter from the Brazilian consul in Munich, Teixeira da Mesquita do Peter Ade. The names Kandinsky and Klee, although the first was Russian and the latter Swiss, would be received with interest, and we feel these masters can be classified as German artists. Ney, Werner, Winter, and Hartung should be a major presence. Furthermore, the director of the museum told us to suggest to include the entire original Bauhaus group. End of quote. The another letter, Neomar Muniz Sodre Bittencourt, Rio's director, remarks that it may also be interesting to show architecture at the exhibition in Munich, and that she was now thinking of, quote, putting together representative works of the modern artistic trends in Brazil between 1915 and 1958. We are now certain that, getting to know the latest artistic achievements, our work will be extremely useful for the deepening of cultural ties between our two countries. From the German side, there was not only a strong interest in the new biennial in Sao Paulo, but also in Brazilian architecture. The first biennial of Sao Paulo in 1951 played a major role in shaping the transcultural exchange with Latin America. In the 1950s, the Federal Republic of Germany was interested in participating in such prestigious international cultural events, which were co-financed and co-organized by the Department of Arts and Culture at Germany's Foreign Office. A letter from the curators at Haus Kunst to the Museo de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo, written in the summer of 1951, shows that at the time many institutions and individuals started looking abroad. The letter asks about the possibility to send German artists to the biennial. This letter, as it seems, became the starting point for the exhibition of Brazilian artists a few years later, as it was also communicated there was an interest in an exhibition of South American artists in which 800 to 1,000 works could be shown. End of quote. Although today we cannot be certain whether this was a genuine or intended as a negotiation tool for German participation in Sao Paulo. However, as we know today, Germany's participation had already been agreed upon through the Foreign Office in this summer, and a group of artists had already been chosen by Ludwig Grote. He coordinated the German contribution to the biennial in Sao Paulo 4 times until 1958. Although shared by Lourival Gomes Machado, artistic director of Museo de Arte Moderna and the Biennial in Sao Paulo, the interest in an exhibition of Brazilian art in Germany did not immediately materialize back then in 1951. It seems that the cooperation between Brazil and Germany was mainly due to the efforts of Frank Teixeira da Mesquita, the Brazilian consul in Munich. However, no concrete ideas about the scope of such an exhibition were conceived by the people in charge at the Haus der Kunst, possibly due to a lack of specific knowledge about Brazilian artists. Instead, Munich only communicated its ideas about the financial side of the project. Consequently, the introduction of the publication was written by Ludwig Grote, who knew Brazil through his visits at the Biennial. In it, he explains the latest interest in Brazilian art, mainly referring to new developments in Brazilian architecture. He writes in his introduction, quote, "Architecture is the mother of the arts. In Brazil, the fine arts have experienced a boom through it. Here, modernism is a vibrant, fresh form of existence. It turns out that the path the European avant-garde took at the beginning of our century developed into a style of international dimensions received like the Gothic style or the Renaissance once were. Modernism has gained depth and radically dug its way all the way down to the roots of creativity. The fundamental and the primitive are values exposed and bared through the arts in Brazil as well. as an architecture, in spite of the commonalities in technology and function, national or landscape-related characteristics emerge, and the fine arts of Brazil are developing a national idiosyncrasy perceptible to outsiders, even though it cannot quite be put into words yet. We can see how the European schools are reflected in it, but the mirror is a tropical country of enormous proportions, end of quote. A diplomatic and enlightening answer to Grote's evaluation that Brazilian art was a mirror of European achievements can be found in the catalogue's introduction to the Brazilian art of the 20th century, written by Carlos Fleischer Ribeiro, professor of art history and aesthetics at the University of Rio de Janeiro. He counters that, quote, the perception of the world on this side and on the other side of the Atlantic is not the same. Historical and especially cultural factors continuously influence the development of art. From this perspective, this collection is a joint effort. Today's work of art are brought to people's consciousness, enabling them to compare our way of seeing and feeling things with the way our contemporaries in Europe see and feel things. End of quote. It is especially this passage that points to the idiosyncrasy of Brazilian art, the explicitly sensual, emotional component Brazilian artists began to develop from the 1960s. With the exhibition of Brazilian artists, Neumar Muniz Sodré Bittencourt did not only offer a representative overview of artistic endeavors in Brazil back then, but included works by Lígia Clark, Lígia Papi, Alfredo Volpi, Valdemar Cordeiro, Flávio de Carvalho, or Ivan Serpa. She also brought together artists that have become major names in the international art world over the past few years. The director had sent a remarkable selection of about 150 paintings, 40 sculptures, and 50 prints and drawings from Rio de Janeiro to Munich. All works stem from the period between 1950 and 1959. The only exception is a series of panels with woodcuts and lithographs by Lithuanian-Brazilian modernist Lazare Segal, who had died 2 years earlier. Segal had studied at the Academy in Dresden from 1910 and moved to Brazil in 1924. He had participated in exhibitions in Latin America as well as Europe, and he had also been part of the exhibition that Generate Art in Munich. It is unknown to me so far if this issue was key to Muniz Sodré Bittencourt's decision to include Segal's works on paper from this particular historical period. The works selected by her include pieces that could be classified as informal art, such as Franz Kreigsberg, Claro, or Antonio Bandeiras' Cidade Vermelha. Works drawing on early Brazilian modernism, such as Mulher by Di Cavalcanti, which are explicitly Brazilian in motive and color, but also geometrical, concrete works by Sao Paulo artists, such as Valdemar Cordeiro, Contradição Espacial, or Mauricio Nogueira Lima, Reticulo Transcendental, and concrete works from Rio de Janeiro, such as Faixas Ritmadas by Ivan Serpa and the new works by Lígia Clark. The latest work by Lígia Clark, one of today's flagship of Latin American art, was sent to Munich. Unity number 127, 58, Modulated Surfaces Series B number 3, and Modulated Space number 2 and number 4 from 58 and 59, while 2 other paintings from the series Modulated Surfaces remained at the storage. As in the case of almost all other artists, 1 to 2 works were not exhibited in the end. In this context, it is especially interesting that Unity 127, a series of 7 black and white paintings, had already been shown at the first neo-concrete exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro in March '59. So they must have been sent directly to Germany from this exhibition. Ribeiro did not mention the neo-concrete movement in his art historical overview, although he must have been aware of it. To name the most prominent example, Leisure Clark put her concept of the organic line and the spatial line or the light line into practice in her series of modulated surfaces, thus laying the foundation for three-dimensional painting. Through this, she laid the foundation for an installation-oriented, participatory, and that art that sought a direct physical dialogue with the observer. This revolutionary concept can only be understood when compared to Max Bill's concept of structure as a passport of the artist's personality, as Bill quoted this. Bill made this the main theme of his exhibition 50 Years of Concrete Art at Helmhaus, Zurich in 1960, to prove that concrete art was, quote, still evolving, end of quote, a concept, however, that did not dare to take the decisive step beyond the flat space determined by the painting. Today, no photographs exist of the exhibition of Brazilian artists in Munich, and apart from an article in Weltkunst, I have not been able to find any reviews. Although a special edition about Brazil had been announced as a letter in the archive proves, the coverage in the traditional publication Weltkunst took up no more than a single column. In it, the Brazilian art was described and occasionally misinterpreted, as we know, as unreflected optimism, as a mixture of eclectic dispositions, memories, and impulses, and as highly imaginative. In the case of abstract compositions, the review of Westkunst even calls them remindful of the decorative talent of the native population. A search for Brazilian and international characteristics dominates the coverage of the follow-up exhibition at Kunstmuseum Schloss Moosbroich, about which 10 regional reports can be viewed at the local town archives today. The reviewers recognize works remindful of Ben Nicholson, Nicolas de Staël, Hans Hartung, or Max Beckmann. As for concrete art, they identify a Bauhaus heritage or references to architecture. In fact, that half the works exhibited were by female artists was also found worthy of mention, which in 1959 it certainly was. The exhibition's coverage reflects the tendencies of art criticism during the 1950s, focusing on describing works and classifying them within the official art canon. It is also clear that, as expected, the exhibition of Brazilian artists did not receive a lot of media attention. The works shown were too obscure even for the blossoming art market emerging at the time. Some were, however, sold at the exhibition. As Grote had written in his introduction, the national idiosyncrasy of Brazilian art could not yet be put into words to describe it to outsiders. Today, the exhibition of Brazilian artists is a very revealing example of how, after the war, a German institution exhibited international, non-European art and used this intervention in the context of its cultural policies. Although it is only marginally possible to reconstruct the art historical significance from the German side today, and there was obviously kindness in such cultural policies and affection without ulterior motives, the exhibition played an important role in the opening of the country to international and not only North American society, even though it was quickly forgotten again. Thank you.
Thank you, Okui, and thanks to all the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this enlightening conference. Well, paraphrasing Jean Giraudoux in a convoluted way, we must begin saying that in Latin America, the post-war never took place, just because the war never happened. To use the idea of post-war as a meaningful time division to address Latin American art, as I'm doing here, is actually to force, in a certain way, European historical patterns to a very different scenario. It is true that World War II had a global impact, and that perhaps its main consequence was to start decolonization in Africa and Asia, a process that changed the world. It has been said that the main war loser was actually the British Empire. However, to coin the term Second World War to refer to what was mainly a European Pacific conflagration might repeat centralizing models. Latin America was in peace all along this war, and we could say that it actually sold its peace when taking advantage of the situation to trade its products without competence at inflated prices. The World War and the post-war were, in general, periods of strong economic expansion for the region. From the so-called stabilizing development, Desarrollo Estabilizador, in Mexico under President Miguel Alemán's administration, to President Juscelino Kubitschek's 50 years of progress in 5 years, in Brazil, a utopia of development coincided in Latin America with the post-war period. The economic strategies of desarrollismo, modernization, industrialization, urban development, the building of infrastructures, and even the creation of a new capital city under modern ideals in Brazil were key part of what has been suggested as a new modernity in the continent. While many European and Japanese cities were turned into ruins by the war, Latin American cities experienced dramatic growth by the early 1950s. And by the early 1950s, Sao Paulo was full of skyscrapers and looked like a set for Fritz Lang metropolis. The key expansion of an urban, industrial, modern sector reinforced, as never before, the links between Brazil's internal economic, social, and cultural processes and the international economic system's dynamic. On the contrary of traditional oligarchies in Latin America, the Sao Paulo bourgeoisie, the richest and most powerful in the region, has always been sophisticated, cosmopolitan, urban, and thoroughly inclined to modernization. As part of the fluent economy and the new spirit, the city became an active center for modern art in the post-war period. A museum of modern art was founded in 1948, we already saw that, and another one in Rio de Janeiro 1 year later. The first Sao Paulo Biennial had its first edition in 1951. The second biennial to be created after Venice, its aim was to open the city to mainstream modern art from the West. However, since the celebration of the Week of Modern Art in 1922, almost 30 years before, the city had become the locus for avant-garde arts in Brazil. Modern art was already present in the country earlier in the 20th century, with such artists as Anita Malfatti, Emiliano di Cavalcanti, and Tarsila do Amaral, and with poet Oswald de Andrade's influential ideas about anthropophagy. And we have been here discussing about terminology and about the necessity of coining new terms, more appropriate ones, and perhaps, well, anthropophagy was a contribution to that early in the 20th century. The most important thing Max Bill ever did was to visit Brazil. The Swiss concrete artist and architect had a big solo show at the Sao Paulo Art Museum in 1950, when he also gave lectures in that city and in Rio. 1 year later, he won the international, here again, sculpture award at the first Sao Paulo Biennial. In 1952, he toured Brazil, lecturing under the Brazilian government's invitation. He preached an objectively constructed art based on mathematics, which was the extreme outcome of the geometric abstract tendency coming from suprematism, constructivism, the style, and the school of Ulm. Such concrete art doctrine had momentum in Brazil's new modern industrial and urban post-war experience, achieving an extraordinary impact that has influenced Brazilian art ever since. More important and historically influential than Bill's own work and ideas was the process that he triggered off in the South American country. He contributed to provide the underlying elements for an artistic strain that was superseded by poetics far more original and productive, and which gave a definite constructive imprint to a most valuable art scene of our day. A concrete art movement began in Sao Paulo in 1952 with the groups Noigandres and Ruptura. The name of this last, Rupture, told about a reaction against both Brazil's figurative, nationalist, subjective, and frequently expressionist modernism, and to action painting. In the context of post-war modernization in Brazil, concrete artists looked to get over what they considered localist modern art in a search of universality. So what they were, of course, trying to go beyond this, but I don't know if they actually compress this here. So it was a jeitinho. The first national exhibition of concrete art was organized in 1956 at Sao Paulo's Museum of Modern Art and was presented the next year in Rio with great repercussion. As a result of the close interaction of concrete art and concrete poetry at the time in Brazil, the show included poets who were very influential also to the arts, especially Haroldo de Campos and Ferreira Goulart. Yet the exhibition already showed noticeable differences between Sao Paulo and Rio artists, which led to the cessation of this last. Rio artists reacted in opposition to concretism's rationalist orthodoxy, signed by scientism, positivism, objectivism, and Gestalt theory, in favor of expression and subjectivity. In 1959, they published the Neo-Concrete Manifesto, which indicated the influence of phenomenology in general, and Ernest Cassirer, Suzanne Langer, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty in particular, and opened the first neo-concrete art exhibition at the Rio de Janeiro's MoMA. Neo-concretism stuck to geometric abstraction and opposed representation, but proposed the notion of living organism against that of machine. The movement introduced subjectivity and a sensual, playful approach that led people to humorously name the Rio cessation as concretism with a beach. And again, well, here we have a new term also to consider. Ligia Clark and Elio Oiticica went deeply into the beach. Both had participated in the first exhibition of concrete art and were later active members of the neo-concrete secession, always as painters. In 1959, Oiticica took painting off the wall, making it to explode out as a three-dimensional artwork which created a physical space that could be toured by the audience. Abstract geometric painting was not transformed into sculpture, but into a quasi-architectonic space articulated by flat painted elements. In fact, it continued to be a rebellious painting by keeping painting's formal elements and relations. Oiticica soon moved ahead, and these painting installations became the beach itself, following a natural process. They mutated into places, inspired by favela's spontaneous architecture in which people could rest, enjoy themselves, and have different experiences. Ernesto Neto's current environments follow a similar line. Oiticica went even further in his evolution. Produced in the early 1960s, his parangoles were living, dancing paintings, while his bolides were sets of diverse objects to be manipulated by the audience to obtain what the artists call suprasensorial experiences. The issue of participative art was taken perhaps more radically by Clark, who in 1959 built geometric sculptures to be handled and transformed by the public, and much more radically, from 1963 on, she conceived art artifacts that were actually tools for collective exchange in interactive and playful events, dubbed living experiences by the artist. And in other cases, to explore and become aware of our own bodies and sensibility. In just a decade, art in Brazil went a long way out from concretism, yet the advanced achievements by Clark, Oiticica, Ligia Pape, and others were an indirect and astonishing result of it, and of geometric abstraction's long lineage. Concretism ideas were swiftly overpassed in Brazil. They neither generated major artists within the movement, rigid poetics, nor launched advanced geometric abstraction tendencies, as the very important ones in Argentina and Venezuela. Nevertheless, concrete art achieved a broader impact by triggering radical new practices, neo-concretism and beyond, and by functioning as a base to be subverted by artists, while simultaneously giving a general consistency to Brazilian art. Also, concretism searched for universality in opposition to nationalist modern art focused on constructing cultural identity. Inclined art in Brazil, what? It's a loop, right?
It's looping.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, it's too fast?
That's really far.
Oh, it was 3 seconds.
Really far.
No, but why? It's, I mean, it was 3 seconds. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. Concretism search for universality in opposition to nationalist modern art focused on constructing cultural identity. Inclined art in Brazil, in general terms, away from the vernacular until today, contrary to the prevailing tendency in Latin America. There has been so much insistence on the constructive nature of this art that it might actually be regarded as another of those cliches we art historians are so fond of. Yet the cliché is partially true. The poetics of concrete art and its remnants and fragments are a notable part of the way in which much art is done in Brazil. When we look at the work of artists of different ages and trends all over the country, we notice how often Brazilians tend to set up structures of form and content, create unusual new realities, organize components serially, work by adding units, and use geometry or a certain mathematical energy, both directly and indirectly, among other features associated to constructive art. However, the extraordinary influence of concrete poetics in Brazilian art has been more evident in the heterodox disarrangement of its precepts than its adherence to them. Many Brazilian artists conceive their works by the formal and conceptual resource of disarranging structures. Such a disarrangement may be executed in the formal dimension of the work, its content, its projection, or in all three. It is a deconstructive procedure both in relation to constructive aesthetics and in the Derridian sense of the term. That's it, a reverse constructivism, a denial of a structure from within the structure itself, and a criticism that is at the same time self-criticism. In so doing, the deconstructuring operation actually constructs meaning in its multiple implications. A fair portion of Brazilian art requires pre-established frameworks on art within which to exert its freedom. It is not only a design procedure, but a quite complex and subtle variety of aesthetic discursive strategies performed to create meaning. In a way, many artists subvert the constructive framework from inside without breaking it. Rather, they expand its possibilities toward uncharted fields, invigorating them anew and introducing a pulsating tension that generates meaning. The frequency of this operation in Brazil must have originated from the neo-concrete movement, a disarrangement whose ambiguous and multidirectional influence lasts to date, deeply rooted in the country's artistic dynamics. Thank you.
I think that, Gerardo, your last, the model that you presented at the end is something that connects very well with something that Reiko Tomi was speaking about yesterday, just in terms of negativity as a model of mapping how all of these different movements from around the world respond to each other. And I'd like to just sort of open with that sort of model and add it to sort of the methodological models that we were discussing yesterday. In taking that as a model, I also wanted to point out to all of you, whether, I don't know if you know this or not, but Gutai in Japan, it was also a movement that called itself by the name of a concrete. So gutai actually means concrete. So what's interesting to me is actually seeing how, although these movements are not connected, and Pedro Eber has done some research on thinking about the connections between gutai and concretism, and it seems like there aren't that many connections, but that they are in some way responding to the sort of political mapping that we've been talking about over the last few days. So the landscape that is defined by a certain kind of realism and a certain kind of lyrical abstraction linked to, the capitalist bloc, communist bloc, and then as we've been developing a richer map over the last few days that also includes the non-aligned movements. So my question to you is a question about politics. Where do the politics of concretism fit in? It seems to me that it's a little bit more complicated than lyrical abstraction and socialist realism, and that there are some nuances, obviously, that take place between countries, and also some places of obscurity that make it quite difficult to figure out what it is that these artists were thinking about from a political perspective.
Do you mean concretism in general, or the interplay that took place in Brazil?
I'm trying to figure out something a little bit more transnational. So yes, in Brazil, but also, where does it fit in this map that we've been trying to construct over the last few days?
Well, I don't know if I am prepared to answer your question, because I am not a concretism scholar at all. But well, there's what you find is to me is that concretism has this sort of universal aspiration, which is also related to design, architecture, and to modernization. So I think that's a general politics about that regarding this art, and that which try to oppose a more expressionist and modernism that was based on subjectivity. So there was perhaps a policy against that in a way that was able to satisfy both totalitarian aspirations of a design world in every aspect, even the eugenetic human being and all that, and on the other hand, capitalist modernization. I think that there's an underlying aspiration to that in concretism. So it's very clear that concretism never tried to stay within the art field, but always has like broader aspirations to transform the cities, to transform society, industrial development, design, universal communication through an abstract language that could be understood by everybody around the world. So it was also universalistic. So that's what I find, and that's why, to me, what happened in Brazil was very interesting, because all those ideas were there and they had momentum because Brazil was expanding. It was a moment of great hope and an economic expansion, and Brasilia was founded, and was a Juscelino Kubitschek's days of the new frontier and all that. So, but almost immediately something happened there, in which, I mean, the other poetic ideas and aspirations and feelings that were there transform concretism without breaking it. So it wasn't a reaction like, well, to throw shit on a concrete painting or, to turn it, to break it, but it was trying to transform it and disarrange it without breaking its general frame. So to me, this is a very interesting process that took place and which is perhaps giving some lessons to current complexities in cultural interactions.
So, thank you. I'm here. Thank you for your lectures. I have a question to Susanne Neubauer, and I'm very sorry if I should. Maybe I missed the part of your lecture, but did only the works travel from Brasilia to Munich, or also the artists? Were they invited maybe to arrange their works here in the museum? And the other question is, were there any contacts to maybe German artists here? And the last, were there any conflicts? Because I think the history of transatlantic connection can also be a history of misunderstanding and understanding. And were there any conflicts between maybe the artists and curators or critics here in Germany?
So your first question about the artists, I'm not sure. I don't think that the artist traveled to Munich because that was it would have been a financial question. So I did not find any hint in the archives that there were artists present here. And the second question about the German artists, I can't answer this question. There's also no proof. There is no, there's nothing I can say. There's no German artist I know who responded somehow about on this exhibition. So it's very hard also to find like source materials about this. And the third question is about the conflicts. As I said at the beginning of my talk, that I have researched the archival situation in Munich, and this next step would be to do the same in the archives in Rio de Janeiro, to see if there is any material that could hint to this, if there were any conflict or not. So far, I would say, of course, it's a project or research on trying to find out the misunderstandings at first hand. This is what I tried to do today. And so it's still something to do, of course. I don't think there were many misunderstandings because the German side, they agree that they were kind of happy that the German exhibition did not take place because they would have had to pay the German exhibition in Brazil, but they received in turn a Brazilian exhibition which was paid by Brazil, so it was kind of a good good thing for the German part. So I hope this answers more or less your question.
Oh, hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a comment and a question. My comment is about, I feel there is overall, Bauhaus has been mentioned quite a few times, the legacy of teaching of Bauhaus still in the post-war. And I was wondering, in a way, the legacy of this teaching, for as much as it was taught differently by different individuals that took it on, actually gives us an element of connection. And actually, I was wondering if maybe at all that could also establish a relationship with Gutai. And the question was actually for Abigail. If I understood you correctly, you said that Daré in the early 50s not only did collage, but also started making sculptures that visitors could manipulate. And I was wondering if you could just add something about that.
I should have given you a better illustration, but Daré made a number of what he called transformable sculptures, and they were very simply made out of plywood, different, I don't know, kind of say dowels or slats of wood that rotated, and so that the viewer could manipulate them. In some cases, if they were joined, the entire structure could itself be manipulated, say on a small scale, 3 feet by 3 feet. In some cases, it's not just a rotational, a circular movement, but also one that's more angular. And he did a number of maquettes, fewer kind of fully kind of realized sculptures, but that was certainly a part of his practice. Certainly also looking to Argentina and correspondence with the Mahdi movement there. I hope that helps.
Hi. So, thank you very much for this panel, which is really exciting and interesting. And my question picks from also main question, and it goes to Abigail, but maybe you can comment the others. So you mentioned how this movement of concretism in Cuba was inscribed in this process of modernization and development and architecture. So I would like to know how this movement inscribes itself within the socio-politics forces of the Batista dictatorship. Because, for example, in my opinion, what you said, actually, and I agree a lot with Gerardo, the constructivist movement could fulfill all models, finally, with this universalist point of view, because if we take the case, my impression, what I know, I don't know if I'm correct, but the constructivists in Cuba, I don't know if they have a kind of understanding with the government or not at all, but they fulfill this process of modernization and industrialization within a conservative system. And for example, if we take the case of Spain, the concrete movement in Spain actually became the counter-movement to the dictatorship very strongly, associated with the Communist Party, and finally considering that we cannot transform society doing abstraction, so let's go to figuration and realism. So I wonder, so this kind of fulfillment of all these models, it depends on the local situation. So I would like you to comment a little bit more the case of Cuba, please. Thank you.
I'll try to answer some of your questions. I'm sorry that I didn't have more of an opportunity to talk about architecture and urbanization in the 1950s. I'll say the best current source is Timothy Hyde's recent book called Constitutional Modernism. He's a scholar at Harvard, was able to work in the Seret archive. Seret and Wiener town planning architects were commissioned by Batista, by the National Institute of Culture, to come up with a pilot plan for Havana and other kind of modernization, urbanization projects beginning in January 1955. And so there, in terms of kind of transatlantic architecture, modernization, the connection here isn't so much to the Bauhaus, but through Corbusier, Gideon, Siam. That's kind of the architectural link. Seret and Wiener came up with a very interesting pilot plan. It was not ever resolved. It was modified in 1958 by the Cuban collaborators with whom they were working, ultimately kind of folded as the Batista dictatorship winded down itself. What was very interesting to me in kind of looking at the plan and reading about it was the application of the Corbusian modular. So the idea of adapting, of building a geometric space from the window to the door to the patio to the block in a way that looks at, say, Brasilia or other Latin American cities, of achieving a kind of conceptual patterning and abstraction of the city based on very much a modernist grid. And part of the kind of interest of having this pilot plan in the beginning was to fix the boundaries of Havana itself, to kind of delimit the city, also the utilities, the kind of the financial issue, from the suburbs, which were taking up more and more resources. So this was, in a way, beginning in January 1955, kind of the architectural kind of imprint of the city, certainly a drive to kind of design new roads for cars, to cater to kind of an American, a tourist audience. The hotels were coming to Cuba. Certainly there was American money, the American mafia, etc. The concrete artists in Cuba more or less fell into line with the Batista kind of dictatorship. Carreño, whom I mentioned just very, very briefly, was a minister of culture under Batista. In a way, I hate to kind of blame the messenger, as it were. He tried, I think, to make the best of the situation for artists within Batista to get what was kind of publicized as the 2% art and public programs kind of benefit the idea of giving artists commissions, giving them kind of jobs, even if they didn't like the government, if they protested the dictatorship. I didn't have a chance to talk about Rosonce, the, say, lyrical abstract movement that happened in the earlier part of the decade. They were absolutely anti-Batista. They protested the second Hispano-American biennial, which came to Havana from Spain. The fallout from that, their continued anti-biennial, which lasted almost half a year, going across Cuba, the island, from Havana to the end, and then back, essentially caused Batista Carreño, the National Institute of Culture, to essentially break apart that group through kind of financial incentives. And so as that group kind of folded and lost their political momentum, it seemed, in a way, a new opportunity arose for the concrete artists who weren't obviously implementing their work against Batista, or if they were proposing kind of a utopian society in a way kind of removed enough or at a distance great enough from the reality to allow them to imagine kind of a parallel space. But they were not kind of politically activist in the same way that the Onceños had been 5 and 6 years earlier. Demographically, they were also coming from different social classes. Darie, for instance, was a Romanian Jew who became a Cuban citizen. So Livia was kind of more of a socialite, kind of a later kind of blooming artist. So they were more heterogeneous. On the whole, they were a bit more wealthy. They weren't kind of activists, if you like. And perhaps in part for that reason, concretism, this was implicit in my paper, was a kind of failed project, I think, in Cuba.